Hi, thank you for joining me today on our TV3 Extra. Today we have author Todd Johnson. Todd, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, before we get into your books, you kind of have an interesting background from being a lawyer to a former U.S. diplomat. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Excuse me. When I was in college, I didn't have a real good sense of what I wanted to do. I applied for and got into law school because it was kind of a fallback. Surely I can find a job doing this. But in the meantime, I had a roommate who had been in the Foreign Service, or his father had been in the Foreign Service, stationed in India. And I found that fascinating. So at the same time I applied for law schools, I applied for the Foreign Service, which is the diplomatic corps. That takes a long time. It's a 2 or 3 year process. By the time I got offered a job, I was already finishing law school. And I put that off. I did the testing again. By the time I actually was admitted to the Foreign Service, I had about 5 years of legal service under my belt. And but I did it. I wanted to do it very much. And my wife and I was trained in Chinese, and we were sent to Hong Kong. So that was a short but really fun diplomatic career.
Wow. And following that experience, you went on to continue your career as a lawyer.
I have, yeah. So when I was only in the Foreign Service, my wife and I were there for only about 2 years. There were some medical issues. It's hard to take care of some of those things when you're on the road, living abroad all that time. So we made a very hard decision to return to the States and for me to go back to legal practice. And I continued that, and I've enjoyed it. It's been a rewarding career. But ever since, even prior to learning about the diplomatic corps, I'd always wanted to write. I'd written short stories even in elementary school. I'd submit them whenever I could squeeze them into English class as a response to an assignment. I'd write a little chapter of something. And so when I kept telling myself I was going to write a novel, and finally time kept going on, and I finally said, I can put this off forever. But finally, when I was in my early 50s, I sat down and just started to write. I said, it's now or never. So that got me started in my dream of being a novelist.
And you live in the Twin Cities, is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep, in Edina.
Excellent. Mm-hmm. Excellent. All right. And now on to your books. You have 4 books out. Could you tell us a little bit about them?
Sure. So, and in fact, you can see over my shoulder, those are the book covers. My son has given me a book cover every time a book has come out. It's been a really neat gift. The first book I wrote, I had kind of a unique way that I came to writing or to being published. I was actually introduced to Bethany House Publishing through a friend of mine, and they took a look at some of my ideas. I did not have an agent, which is, of course, the most common way to approach this. But they took a look based on a writing sample I said, and they said, give us some pages on this one idea, the first idea I had, which was called the deposit slip. I'd already assigned that name to it, which was based on a case we had in our office of a farmer who he passed away, and his son went up to take care of his affairs and found a deposit slip to the local bank for over $1 million in his safe deposit box. Had no clue where it was from. The bank denied that money had ever been in their bank, and he proceeded to bring a lawsuit to try to figure out where was this $1 million that his dad had the deposit slip for. So that was the genesis for my first book. And Bethany House said they would publish it. And after that book came out, they were pleased enough that they signed me to a 3-book contract. And the second book was called Critical Reaction. That's a book that also is based upon a true case about 10 nuclear workers who were caught up in an explosion at the Hanford nuclear plant out in eastern Washington. And the contractor out there did very little to actually find out what had caused the explosion and what they'd been exposed to, which made them understandably very nervous. And so once again, we were involved in the litigation to find out what radiation had they been exposed to, why was it being covered up, and so forth. And that was the genesis for my second book. The third book is called The Fatal Trust, and that was the first work of pure fiction, just an idea, the notion that, but although it was based on a true event, in that I had actually been to an art show in the late 70s. It was a showing of the art of, who was the famous post illustrator, Norman Rockwell. Just months before he passed away. And within about a week after I'd been there, there was the greatest art theft in Minnesota history, and a number of those paintings were stolen. Most of them were never recovered until in the early 2000s. And this book is based upon a story of an attorney who discovers that right in the 2000s, early 2000s, that perhaps his family was involved in that art theft, and he's drawn in to deal with some of the proceeds of that in a trust that he has to try to get to the bottom of. So that's the third book. And the fourth book is the one that I think brought you to talk to me, The Barrister and the Letter of Marque.
Yeah, it's quite a difference from your first three books.
Yes, although it's still a legal thriller. I mean, all three of the other ones shared that. It's just a legal thriller set in the year 1818.
Yes. So what made you take that jump into historical fiction?
Well, I always loved history. I studied history in college, and I do a lot of reading about it. And when I got done with the third legal thriller set in, contemporary legal thriller, I thought, this is fun. I'm really enjoying it. I could write a legal thriller in my sleep because I've practiced for so long. But wouldn't it be fun to explore what it would be like to have a legal thriller, or the kind of the aspects of a legal thriller and a mystery, but set it back in an interesting time period? And so that set me to researching what would be an interesting time period. And I settled on the Regency period in the early 1800s because that was a very interesting time in English history, and particularly in the legal realm. And
what made that an interesting time?
The Regency period is probably anybody who loves romance books has read Jane Austen, and probably contemporary fiction set in that time period. And it was a time of great change. And, it was named after the Regent King, or Regent Prince, who took over for his insane father and ruled in his stead while his father was still alive for over a decade. And he happened to be a very fallible person. He did not have a great moral background, but he loved the arts. He loved architecture, and he surrounded himself by creative people. And over the period of his rule and in the years that followed, there was just a lot that went on in England: rebuilding of London, restructuring of their arts, a support for the arts, whether it be musical or painting, and so on. And out of that came a huge reform of the legal system, and changed some of the things to a legal system that we would recognize today from one we wouldn't have recognized. So all that was happening in the late 18 teens.
And that is one thing I noticed when I was reading. I was wondering if what I was reading was actually true, because they seemed so close to our laws today.
Well, it is true. I took a few, some of the things I could not have written a very good book about a legal conflict in the courtroom without taking a few liberties, but they're relatively small. Some of the bigger things that you, and this is accurately portrayed in the book, that you would not recognize are the fact that, first of all, a person was not presumed innocent. They were implicitly assumed guilty. And typically, the notion that you didn't have to testify against yourself, the fifth, taking the fifth, in American parlance, didn't exist either. In fact, the most important witness in every proceeding was the person who was accused. In fact, they would have them stand in the dock, and they had special windows set up so that the light would shine on their face to ensure that the jury had the clearest view of the accused when they were testifying, because they were 95%, in their view, about 90% or 95% of getting to the truth was watching that witness testify. So those things weren't in place, but some of those things did come into place by the 1830s. So this was a time of change. You're right, the courtroom scenes are familiar, but most of those things really already were in place. And when I did my research, that was the thing I found most interesting, is that not only were many of the same structures in place, but the same strategies were in place. And I read a wonderful book by a barrister, an autobiography, and he's talking about the process of taking on a case and the investigation and finding an expert to testify. And I'm reading this and thinking, my goodness, he did the same thing I have been doing 200 years later, even to the how do we capture the jury's attention? And it was, what was striking is how much of that was already in place.
I think that is all so interesting. So what type of research did you do for this book?
Well, I read a lot of books about I sort of started from the macro and worked down. So I read a lot of books just about the Regency period. And then from there, I wrote a number of books and a number of PhD theses. Those are great resources I found for arcane information about the legal system. And as well as this autobiography I mentioned to you, from that barrister was a little bit later in the 19th century, but gave great insights. And then I started reading books that got down to other kind of fundamentals, like what was London like? I mean, I've traveled to London before, but London today is not what it was in 1818. And so I got a very good book that followed the changes in London starting in the late 1700s up through really to the early 1900s. When was this place developed? When did that change? Trying to capture what it looked like at the time. And that's I guess the bulk of it.
You know, I was looking at your website at the video that you did about the different books you used to research this. And I thought that one about the old maps looked really interesting.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we've all heard of anybody who likes, is interested in England or reading about that period will have heard of different districts in town. What they may not realize is some of the districts that were really suburbs. They were quite, outside of the kind of what was central London at that time. Now, of course, they're part of the core of London. But yes, those maps were very helpful. Sometimes I'd have to use a magnifying glass and try to get down and actually see, well, what is the name of that street that joins that particular park. But it was fun.
You know, another thing that I kept thinking about as I was reading the book is how the corruption seemed to parallel what we are seeing today, but I guess more in a general corruption. But is today's law corrupt like it seemed to be back then?
Corruption is a big word. There's a lot of strategy that goes on. There's a lot of what people don't realize quite often. They get into a legal circumstance, hopefully only once in their life if they're fortunate, and they think, well, it's just as simple as laying out the facts, and you're going to see that I'm correct, and I'll be exonerated or receive damages, whatever it might be. What they don't realize is that there is a lot of strategy that goes on in the law, and a lot of the justice you're going to receive depends upon the skill of your attorney, not just in gathering the evidence and presenting it, but in posturing it, hopefully getting the right judge, knowing how to approach that judge, certainly figuring out how to best win over the minds and hearts of the jury. And that's not really corruption, but what it is it's I don't know, it's sort of the human element that goes into the law, which in a way we'd like to think, no, it's no human element. It's just, the way the scales of justice. But no, there's a bit of a cynical saying, how much justice can you afford? If you can get a better attorney who is better at those strategies, then you're going to get a better result.
Okay, I can see that. So getting back to the book, can you tell us a little bit about it and what a letter of marque is? I do have to say that the whole time I was reading it, in my head, I kept saying marquee.
Yes. Yeah, I had to stop myself from doing the same. I looked it up. Is it really letter of marque? It's a French term, of course. Well, the book, the genesis of the book, first of all, I looked for a period where I could write an historic, legal novel. And as I shared with you, the reasons why I came to this period. But there was an event that had happened actually earlier than this, probably as much as I think it was 80 or 100 years before this, where an individual named Captain Kidd, who a lot of people have heard of that name in pirate circles, he actually obtained a letter of marque to travel to the Indian Ocean and take ships there. And what was a letter of marque? Letters of marque were an instrument created by the crown, and not just of England, but the crowns throughout the world. And what it did is that they would issue this letter of marque to a private ship owner, and it would authorize that ship owner to act as though they were a part of the Royal Navy. It was a way of expanding your Navy without building new ships. They would call them privateers. And that meant that they could go out and take whatever was considered enemy ships. It could be pirates. It could be a foreign country's ships, under the umbrella of protection that you were acting as on an official status. So therefore, your actions would not subject you to a claim that you were a pirate. And we have letters of marque to this day. In fact, in the United States Constitution, there's provision for issuing letters of marque in time of war. Pardon me. In any event, Captain Kidd went out and did this, and he returned after a long voyage to the Indian Ocean, to the American coast, and he docked, and he was accused of piracy. He was taken into custody, accused of committing piracy when he was on the high seas. And he said, "No, I have a letter of marque." They said, "Show it to us." And he said, can't put my hands on it." He was ultimately tried, and he was ultimately hung. And his letter of marque was found in the British archives during World War I, about 200 years later. It had been misplaced, or some would say deliberately hidden by some of his investors. That was the genesis for this idea. And in this case, a young woman whose estate is collapsing because of the high tariffs and taxes that followed the Napoleonic War in England, has hired or purchased a ship and put her cousin as captain of the ship to go out. And he in turn has acquired a letter of marque from some investors to go to the Indian Sea and take smugglers' cargoes from carrying tea from China. But when he returns to England, much like Captain Kidd, he finds himself arrested. And when he goes to his cabin to retrieve the letter of marque and show his legal justification for what he'd done, that letter has disappeared. And this is the legal case that ensues from that.
So why was tea so important at that time?
Tea was like gold. This was in the early stages of the tea trade. When I first started to write the book, I assumed that for example, that the ship would be looking for smugglers coming out of India or Ceylon with tea. But this was so early on that the only tea being acquired was from China. But tea was becoming very, very popular in England and in other parts of Europe, and so it was a very, very sought after commodity. And if you could I did a lot of research into how much was tea worth, and how much tea could you hold in the hold of a brigadier or a brig, and I concluded that you could hold enough in your car with a single trip to become a very wealthy individual. So that was the importance of tea. And in the book, that's the reason that this Lady Jameson and her cousin send the ship to seek that particular commodity because it was so incredibly valuable.
You mentioned that this was all taking place after the Napoleon War. Is the conflict going on due to the increased taxes from that war?
Yeah, I mean, the war had off and on really been going on since 1790, I think it was 1796, but particularly since the start of the 19th century, 1800, and really only ended with the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. That was 15 long years in which England was at war, off and on, but mostly all the time, with Napoleon and with France. And it also was coming on the heels of the war in America, in which America became free from British rule. So the British Crown's coffers were extremely low, and they responded by raising tariffs and raising taxes on their remaining empire, and it was a very tough time. And in fact, and you'll know from reading the book, smuggling is a piece of the book. Smuggling was just rife in that time period. Virtually everyone was involved in it because it was the only way to survive and still get the goods and commodities you needed during those times.
And now back to the characters in the book, Lady Jameson and William Snopes. They are some flawed individuals and make some bad choices, but they are likable characters. It seemed like they had a foundation of faith that helps them at times. How do you navigate what they are going to go through?
Well, early on, I got some very good advice from my editor, and he said, "Todd, your characters, don't make them perfect. They'll be uninteresting and they'll be unrealistic. Recognize that they're going to have flaws." And so I did that. I've done that in all of my books, but particularly here. And the type of flaws they had just kind of flowed naturally as I thought through the characters. And as you know, one of the assistant barrister has a terrible gambling problem. The assistant to William Snopes. William Snopes himself doesn't suffer from that issue, but he has some hubris and perhaps overconfidence. In any event, so my thinking was also with these books. My books tend to be inspirational, but they're not in the sense that some inspirational books are written. My books aren't really evangelizing or proselytizing, but the characters are, as I am, rooted in a place of faith. That doesn't mean they don't deviate from that faith, but that's where they're coming from, and of course that's particularly would be true in the early 19th century, where the Anglican Church was preeminent, and it would be surprising if people didn't have some rooting in faith in that time frame, but certainly my characters do, and they struggle with that, as you saw in various circumstances.
Yes, I think a lot of us can relate to that. But I really liked the book, and I liked the conclusion to the case, but I kind of felt like you were setting up a potential series, fingers crossed. So please say yes that you are, so that I can find out what happens to William and Madeline.
Well, I'm when I wrote this book, I actually had been in the process of writing an historic fiction book about Ernest Hemingway in his last year or two in Cuba. And I had completed the book and sent it off. It was not a book that I was going to place with my current publisher. And I still owed a third book to my publisher under my contract I mentioned. So I finished that book and went on to write the Barrister book. Once the Barrister was out for publication, I returned to the Hemingway book, and I'm finishing a rewrite of that book, which I hope to have done in the next month or so. And then, as you discerned, my intent is to come back, and my goal was to write a series. You know, when I had in the back of my mind as I came up with this period and these characters, that what I would love to do is have kind of an amalgam of Sherlock Holmes and Rumpole of the Bailey. If you're familiar with that show, it was a show set in England in the 1970s in the Old Bailey courthouse. Kind of a mix of those kind of elements. And so I wrote the book with a wealth of characters. And I did that deliberately, knowing, though, you have to always be careful not to slow your plot too much with too many characters. But I deliberately had probably more characters than you might see otherwise, because I have plans for those characters. And my working title, which may change, but right now for the next book, is The Barrister and the Mad Duchess. And I hope to be working on that again here in the next month or so.
Do you plan on staying in this lane or going back to contemporary fiction?
Well, the first book I wrote, The Deposit Slip, I wrote with an eye towards possible sequel, at least. Not a series necessarily, but at least a sequel. And I would like to get back to that. But really, at this point in my career writing, I would love to just write William Snopes books. At least I feel that way. Maybe after another book or two, I won't feel that way. But I really would like to get back to it. I have a lot of ideas for books engaging his assistant barrister, his junior, his solicitor, Obadiah. So I've got a number of ideas rolling through my head. But I also have some other ideas for historic novels. I think the one thing that I'm pretty intent upon, unless I do a sequel for The Deposit Slip, is to stay in the historic novel realm. And frankly, it's likely that many, if not all, those books will have some legal element to them. So I guess that's probably the very wide lane that I see for myself.
Do you enjoy the research process, or does it get a little time consuming? I could see myself going down the rabbit hole and not coming out.
No, I really do enjoy the research, but I do get impatient. After I've done some research, it's like, okay, I got these ideas that are bubbling up. I want to start getting them on paper. But it was interesting. I did, as I shared with you, I did a lot of research for this Barrister book, but readers have caught me in maybe 4 or 5 historic errors. Now, 1 or 2 of them were intentional, not errors so much as I allowed something to exist in 1818 that probably was 4 to 6 years out, and I felt like that was within, that was permissible, but not for someone who loves historic Regency period fiction, because they catch everything, and more power to them. But I would love to have that book. I would love to have done my research so fully that I don't miss a word, because I really want the reader, when they get into this book or any of my books, to lose themselves. And I know that if you're steeped in a period or a subject and you hit one of those stumbling blocks, it draws you out of the book. I don't want them to have that experience. So I'll do as much research as I feel I have to try to get to that place.
Yeah, I'm sure that is hard to navigate at times. I have read some books where they do explain their intentional inaccuracy in an author's note.
It's interesting you say that. I don't know why I didn't think to do it, and my editor should have told me to do it, because as I said, there were 2 or 3 that I felt like writing back to folks who had written a review, and I'd say, wait, I knew that, I really did, and here's why I did it, and it doesn't change anything historically that much. I believe me, I'll have an author's note on that next time. Oh my God.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today and giving your time to do this. I really enjoyed The Barrister and the Letter of Mark, and I look forward to reading your other books as well.
Well, thank you. No, I really appreciate the chance to talk about it, and hope folks will give it a try.
Thank you. And you can see all of Todd's books at his website, authortoddjohnson.com, and you can follow him on social media. Thanks for watching.